There's a terrifying moment in human relationships that almost nobody notices while it's happening. It's not when someone screams. It's not when they block your number. And it's not even when they walk away. The real ending begins much earlier than that. It begins the moment someone emotionally stops reaching for you. Because once a person reaches that point internally, the relationship has already changed in ways most people will never fully understand. And according to Carl Jung, this shift is not random. It's psychological. It's the result of years of emotional imbalance finally reaching a breaking point inside the human mind. One day, the person who once loved you deeply will look at you with complete emotional silence. And that silence will be louder than every argument you ever had. Because when someone makes a final decision about you internally, they rarely announce it first. They detach. And what's terrifying is this: by the time you notice the distance, the decision may have already been made weeks, months, or even years ago. Today, you're going to understand the hidden psychological signs that someone is emotionally closing the door on you, and why Jung believed this transformation changes people permanently. Think about this carefully. Have you ever watched someone slowly stop explaining themselves to you? They stopped arguing, stopped defending themselves, stopped asking for understanding. At first, it looked like maturity, but in reality, it was emotional surrender. And most people completely miss the warning signs because they mistake silence for peace. But silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is the sound of someone emotionally leaving your life while their body is still standing in front of you. The frightening part is that final decisions are rarely emotional explosions. They are quiet conclusions. And once someone reaches that internal conclusion, reversing it becomes incredibly difficult. Because human beings do not emotionally detach overnight. They detach after disappointment repeats itself too many times. Jung believed that when people suppress pain long enough, the psyche eventually transforms in order to protect itself. The person who once tolerated everything suddenly becomes emotionally unreachable. Not because they stopped caring, but because caring became psychologically dangerous to their own well-being. This is why the final decision often feels cold to the other person. But it was not created in one moment. It was built slowly through patterns of disrespect, patterns of paper patterns, patterns of quiet. The biggest moment of Sovad, it was revealed in some heavier bits, pertain patterns of disrespect, of emotional neglect, patterns of imbalance, every ignored feeling, every broken promise, every moment someone felt unseen. It all accumulates beneath the surface until the mind quietly decides, enough. And once that threshold is crossed, something changes permanently. The person stops looking at the relationship through hope and starts looking at it through evidence. That is the moment illusion dies. For a long time, people survive relationships through potential. They tell themselves, they'll change. They didn't mean it. Things will get better eventually. But the final decision happens when reality becomes louder than hope. And once reality takes over, emotional attachment begins collapsing fast. This is why emotionally exhausted people often become unusually calm before leaving. They are no longer fighting internally. The war inside them has already ended. And what makes this psychological shift so powerful is that it changes how they see everything afterward. Suddenly, they notice the manipulation they once excused. They recognize the emotional imbalance they once normalized. They stop romanticizing pain and start protecting their peace. To outsiders, it may look like they suddenly changed. But the truth is, they finally stop betraying themselves. According to Jung, every human being has a shadow, the hidden side of themselves they suppress to maintain approval, attachment, or identity. For many people, especially deeply empathetic individuals, that shadow contains boundaries, anger, Carl Jung believed that emotions never truly disappear simply because a person ignores or suppresses them. Instead, emotions that remain unexpressed continue living beneath the surface of the mind, influencing thoughts, behavior, and personality in hidden ways. This idea becomes especially important in relationships where people constantly silence their own needs to maintain peace. Someone may repeatedly forgive disrespect, ignore emotional pain, or suppress anger because they fear conflict or abandonment. On the surface, they appear patient and understanding, but internally, the emotional pressure continues building over time. Jung explained that the human psyche naturally seeks balance. When one side of a person is overdeveloped, the opposite side eventually begins forcing its way into awareness. For example, a person who constantly presents themselves as endlessly kind, agreeable, and emotionally available may unconsciously bury feelings of resentment, frustration, or self-protection. Those suppressed emotions do not vanish. They accumulate quietly until the mind can no longer contain the imbalance. At that point, behavior begins changing suddenly and dramatically. This is why emotionally exhausted people often seem to transform overnight. The person who tolerated everything becomes distant. The individual who always explained themselves suddenly becomes silent. Their suppressed emotions finally surface, not because they became cruel, but because the psyche is trying to restore equilibrium. Jung referred to this process as psychological compensation, where the unconscious mind forces forward the traits and emotions a person spent years denying. The transformation may appear shocking to others, but internally it is usually the result of years of accumulated emotional suppression finally reaching its limit. When someone stops reacting emotionally, most people assume they no longer care. In reality, emotional silence is often a sign that something much deeper has already happened internally. Human beings naturally react when they still feel emotionally connected to a situation. They argue, explain themselves, seek reassurance, defend their feelings, and fight for understanding because part of them still believes the relationship can improve. Emotional reactions usually come from hope, attachment, and investment. But when a person suddenly becomes calm after repeated emotional pain, it often means the psychological shift has already occurred beneath the surface. According to Carl Jung, the psyche adapts when emotional strain becomes unbearable. If someone spends too long feeling dismissed, emotionally drained, or unsupported, the mind eventually begins protecting itself through detachment. This detachment can appear cold or indifferent from the outside, but internally it is often the result of exhaustion rather than cruelty. The person has reached a stage where reacting emotionally no longer feels useful or safe. This is why emotional silence can feel more unsettling than anger. Anger still contains emotional energy and attachment. Silence often signals withdrawal of that energy entirely. A person who once fought passionately may suddenly stop arguing, stop over-explaining, and stop asking to be understood. They no longer feel the need to convince the other person to care, because internally, they have begun accepting the reality of the relationship. Their nervous system shifts from emotional engagement into emotional preservation. By the time someone reaches this stage, they are often no longer deciding whether to leave emotionally. They are learning how to survive emotionally without the connection. Most relationships do not end the day two people separate physically. The real ending usually begins much earlier, deep within the emotional world of one or both individuals. A person can continue texting, spending time together, and maintaining routines while internally feeling more distant every day. This is because emotional disconnection happens gradually through repeated experiences that weaken trust, safety, and emotional closeness over time. Long before someone officially leaves, their mind often begins preparing for separation internally. This process develops quietly. Small disappointments that once seemed manageable start accumulating beneath the surface. Conversations begin feeling emotionally empty instead of meaningful. Effort becomes one-sided. A person may feel unheard, emotionally neglected, or consistently drained. But instead of expressing it immediately, they often suppress those feelings to avoid conflict or preserve the relationship. According to Carl Jung, the unconscious mind notices emotional patterns long before the conscious mind fully acknowledges them. Even when someone tells themselves everything is fine, their psyche continues registering emotional imbalance in the background. Over time, emotional investment slowly weakens. The person stops imagining a future with the same excitement. They stop feeling emotionally safe enough to be fully vulnerable. Eventually, they begin emotionally adapting to life without a connection, even while remaining physically present within it. This is why some people appear calm or emotionally detached when a breakup finally happens. Their grieving process started long before the relationship officially ended. The physical separation is often only the visible conclusion of an emotional departure that has already been unfolding internally for months or even years. Repeated disrespect damages emotional attachment far more deeply than a single mistake ever could. In most relationships, people can forgive occasional misunderstandings, emotional reactions, or moments of failure because trust still exists beneath the surface. What slowly destroys connection is the repetition of harmful behavior without meaningful change. When someone feels dismissed, ignored, criticized, manipulated, or emotionally undervalued over and over again, the mind begins associating the relationship with emotional pain instead of emotional safety. At first, many people tolerate this behavior because of love, hope, or emotional loyalty. They explain away the disrespect, convince themselves the other person did not mean it, or believe things will improve with enough patience and understanding. However, the human psyche keeps a silent record of emotional experiences. According to Carl Jung, repeated emotional suppression creates internal tension that eventually demands resolution. Every ignored boundary and every repeated disappointment slowly weakens emotional trust beneath conscious awareness. Over time, the person stops feeling emotionally secure in the relationship. The nervous system begins remaining alert instead of relaxed because it expects future hurt based on past patterns. This creates emotional exhaustion. The individual may continue staying physically present, but internally their attachment starts eroding. The warmth, excitement, and emotional openness that once existed gradually become replaced by caution, distance, and emotional fatigue. What makes repeated disrespect so damaging is that it changes how a person sees both the relationship and themselves. They begin questioning their worth, their emotional safety, and whether their needs truly matter. Eventually, emotional detachment becomes a form of self-protection because the mind can no longer survive endless cycles of hurt without creating psychological distance. The shadow self is one of the most important ideas introduced by Carl Jung, and it refers to the hidden parts of a person's personality that they suppress, reject, or deny. These are often traits and emotions that society taught them were unacceptable, such as anger, selfishness, assertiveness, emotional distance, or the ability to say no without guilt. Many deeply empathetic people spend years building an identity around kindness, patience, and self-sacrifice while burying the parts of themselves that are protective or confrontational. Over time, this creates an imbalance within the psyche. When a person repeatedly tolerates emotional pain, manipulation, disrespect, or one-sided relationships, the shadow self slowly begins building pressure beneath the surface. The individual may continue acting calm and understanding externally, but internally, resentment, exhaustion, and emotional frustration continue accumulating. Jung believed that suppressed aspects of the personality never disappear. Eventually, they force themselves into awareness because the psyche naturally seeks wholeness and balance. This is why people sometimes seem to change suddenly after prolonged emotional suffering. The person who once avoided conflict begins setting firm boundaries. Someone who constantly prioritized others suddenly becomes emotionally unavailable or detached. The shadow emerges as a survival mechanism, forcing the person to reclaim traits they previously rejected in themselves. This transformation can appear cold or shocking to others, but psychologically it often represents self-protection rather than cruelty. The shadow self appears most strongly when a person realizes that endless compassion without boundaries leads to self-abandonment. At that point, the psyche begins defending itself by activating the very traits the person spent years suppressing. Silence often reveals more truth in relationships than confrontation, because people can hide behind words, but they struggle to hide patterns of emotional withdrawal. During arguments, individuals frequently react impulsively, defend themselves emotionally, or say things driven by anger and frustration rather than clarity. Loud conflict can temporarily create the illusion that both people are still deeply invested because emotional intensity remains present. However, silence exposes what emotional reactions often conceal. It reveals distance, exhaustion, loss of hope, and emotional detachment in their purest form. According to Carl Jung, the unconscious mind communicates through behavior and emotional shifts long before people consciously admit what they truly feel. This is why silence can become psychologically unsettling. When someone stops explaining themselves, stops arguing, or stops seeking emotional resolution, it often means an internal change has already occurred. They are no longer trying to repair the connection because part of them has emotionally stepped away from it. Silence also removes distractions. Without constant emotional reactions or dramatic conversations, patterns become easier to see clearly. A person begins noticing who genuinely makes effort and who only responds when emotional comfort is being provided to them. In silence, manipulation tactics become more obvious because there is no emotional chaos masking them anymore. What makes silence so revealing is that it forces people to confront reality without emotional noise covering it. Someone who truly values the relationship will eventually move toward understanding, accountability, or effort. Someone who benefited only from emotional control or imbalance will often react with frustration, blame, or resentment once silence removes the emotional dynamic they depended on. Silence becomes a mirror that exposes intentions, priorities, and emotional truth without needing a single explanation. Many people mistake patience for weakness because they fail to understand the emotional strength required to remain calm, forgiving, and understanding in difficult relationships. Deeply empathetic individuals often give repeated chances, avoid unnecessary conflict, and continue showing compassion even after being hurt multiple times. To emotionally mature people, this behavior reflects emotional intelligence and self-control. However, manipulative or emotionally careless individuals frequently interpret that patience as permission to continue crossing boundaries without consequences. Over time, people become accustomed to the empath's availability and emotional labor. They begin expecting endless understanding, constant forgiveness, and unconditional emotional support, as if those qualities are guaranteed rather than earned. Because the empath rarely reacts immediately or aggressively, others assume they will tolerate anything indefinitely. This creates a dangerous imbalance where kindness stops being appreciated and instead becomes normalized. The more the empath overextends themselves without enforcing limits, the more others unconsciously believe the behavior will continue forever. According to Carl Jung, human beings naturally adapt to psychological patterns. When someone consistently sacrifices their own needs to maintain harmony, others begin organizing their behavior around that expectation. The empath's patience becomes part of the relationship structure itself. But once the empath finally withdraws access, sets boundaries, or emotionally detaches, the people who benefited from that imbalance often react with shock, anger, or accusations of coldness. What they are truly reacting to is the sudden removal of unlimited emotional access. They never expected consequences because the empath spent years absorbing discomfort silently. The moment patience ends, people are forced to confront how much emotional support they were receiving without truly valuing it. Only after excess disappears do they realize the patience they once dismissed was actually one of the rarest forms of emotional strength. Emotional detachment is often misunderstood as cruelty, coldness, or lack of care. But psychologically, it is usually a form of self-protection that develops after prolonged emotional exhaustion. When someone spends a long period feeling emotionally drained, manipulated, neglected, or overwhelmed, the mind eventually begins creating distance in order to preserve stability. This process is not typically intentional at first. It happens gradually as the nervous system realizes that constant emotional involvement is causing more pain than connection. At the beginning of unhealthy relationships, People usually react emotionally because they still hope things can improve. They argue, explain themselves, seek reassurance, and continue trying to repair the emotional bond. These reactions show attachment and investment. However, when repeated disappointment continues without meaningful change, emotional engagement begins feeling unsafe or pointless. According to Carl Jung, the psyche naturally seeks balance when emotional strain becomes too overwhelming. Detachment becomes a psychological defense mechanism designed to reduce emotional suffering. This is why emotionally detached people often appear unusually calm. They are no longer reacting from emotional urgency because internally they have started withdrawing their emotional energy from the relationship. Their silence or distance is not always hatred. Many times it is exhaustion. They no longer have the emotional capacity to keep fighting for something that repeatedly harms them. Emotional detachment also creates mental clarity. Once a person stops being consumed by emotional chaos, they begin seeing patterns, manipulation, and imbalance more objectively. They stop responding automatically to guilt, pressure, or emotional control because their nervous system is no longer fully emotionally entangled in the situation. In many cases, detachment is not the absence of feeling. It is the mind's attempt to survive overwhelming emotional pain. When people emotionally awaken within a relationship, they begin realizing that love alone is not enough to sustain healthy connection. For a long time, many individuals stay attached because they focus on another person's potential rather than their consistent behavior. They hold on to hope, believing the relationship will eventually improve if enough patience, understanding, or emotional effort is given. This creates a dangerous psychological habit where words, promises, and temporary moments of affection become more important than long-term patterns of action. Over time, however, reality begins outweighing hope. A person starts noticing that apologies are repeated without behavioral change. Affection appears only when consequences arise, and emotional effort remains one-sided. According to Carl Jung, the unconscious mind constantly observes patterns, even when the conscious mind tries to maintain emotional attachment. Eventually, the psyche reaches a point where it can no longer ignore the evidence in front of it. This is the moment someone stops romanticizing who the other person could become and begins accepting who they consistently choose to be. Instead of asking, "What if they change?" they begin asking, "What has this person repeatedly shown me through their actions?" That shift creates emotional clarity because actions reveal priorities more honestly than words ever can. Once someone starts focusing on evidence instead of fantasy, emotional attachment weakens rapidly. The relationship is no longer protected by denial, excuses, or imagined future versions of the person. Reality becomes impossible to avoid. This realization often feels painful because it forces someone to grieve not only the relationship itself, but also the illusion they spent years emotionally investing in. The emotional bond changes permanently once consistency becomes more important than potential. A final emotional decision in a relationship is rarely sudden or impulsive. Most people do not wake up one morning and instantly stop caring about someone they once deeply loved. Instead, emotional detachment usually develops slowly through accumulated disappointment, repeated emotional injuries, and unresolved patterns that continue over long periods of time. Every ignored feeling, broken promise, dismissed boundary, or moment of emotional neglect adds another layer of exhaustion beneath the surface. Individually, these moments may seem small, but psychologically, they build enormous emotional weight over time. At first, people often tolerate unhealthy dynamics because of love, hope, loyalty, or fear of losing the relationship. They convince themselves that things will improve, that the other person did not mean the harm they caused, or that patience will eventually lead to change. According to Carl Jung, the unconscious mind continuously records emotional experiences even when the conscious mind tries to ignore them. This means the psyche quietly tracks repeated emotional imbalance long before a person openly admits how unhappy they truly are. Eventually, the emotional burden becomes too heavy to continue carrying. The mind reaches a point where hope can no longer outweigh reality. What looks sudden to outsiders is often the final stage of a very long internal process. By the time someone emotionally withdraws or makes the decision to leave, they have usually spent months or even years mentally wrestling with disappointment and emotional conflict. This is why final decisions often appear calm rather than emotional. The person has already processed much of the pain internally. Their detachment is not the result of one isolated event, but a cumulative effect of countless moments that slowly convinced them the relationship was no longer emotionally sustainable. In the end, the final decision someone makes about you is rarely sudden. It is built quietly through patterns, emotional experiences, and accumulated truths. According to Carl Jung, the human psyche cannot endlessly ignore imbalance without eventually transforming. When people feel repeatedly unseen, emotionally drained, or forced to suppress their true feelings, they eventually detach, not out of cruelty, but out of survival. What once looked like endless patience becomes boundaries. What once looked like emotional dependence becomes clarity. The person stops living through hope and starts seeing reality for what it truly is. This transformation is powerful because it marks the moment someone finally chooses self-respect over self-sacrifice. They no longer seek validation, chase understanding, or tolerate emotional imbalance simply to preserve connection. The final decision is not always the end of love. It is often the beginning of awakening.